Hello, I'm David Eichholtz with David Richard Gallery located in New York City. And today with me is Arlo Namingha, and we are standing in his exhibition at our gallery. Arlo is from Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I've actually known him for I think 14 years now.
Yeah.
Our gallery was actually right across the street from his parents' gallery, and that's how I met he and his family. And or him and his family, I should say. And when we moved to New York, I guess it was a couple years ago, his father, Dan Namingha, had an exhibition at a museum, and we went to see it, and Frances, Dan's wife, jokingly, I don't think she was joking, I think she was dead serious, but anyway, she just sort of said, oh, now that you're not in New Mexico, she says, you know, you're in New York, you should show Dan's work. And I thought, well, I always liked Dan's work, but yeah, I couldn't really show it. And then COVID hit, and that sort of put that show on hold, and then and we started kind of getting that going again. And I got to thinking, you know, I was looking back at some of the newer work, some of which we're standing in front of Arlo's, and I thought, you know, I really like Arlo's work, so I called her up. I said, well, what about Arlo as well? and he also has a younger brother, Michael, and Michael actually lives in and out of New York. He's got an apartment here, and so we're actually showing all three of them. But we're focusing today on Arlo, and he's primarily a sculptor, but you also paint and do other things. But your mainstay is sculpture, and that's what we want to focus on. He does work in a wide variety of media, bronzes, which there is one in the exhibition, a lot of stone, different types of stones, we'll talk about that, wood. And so what we want to cover today is sort of the backdrop or the backstory of his work, because as you can see, it's very contemporary, a lot of it very reductive. But it's all rooted in the Hopi culture, which he's a Hopi. Well, you're Hopi Tiwa. So first of all, maybe we ought to start explaining that to people. But the Hopi Reservation, for those of you who don't know, is largely in northern Arizona, and it does extend into northern New Mexico. And so Arlo's mother is from reservation, the San Juan,
right.
Pueblo, which is in northern New Mexico, which is also where his wife, Nicole, who's standing here in the gallery, but on the other side of the room, is from. But your dad is actually from Arizona, and his side of the family is from northern Arizona.
Yes.
And so talk about because the Tiwa, T-E-W-A.
It's Tewa. Yeah.
Tewa, sorry. Is part of the Hopi, is on the Hopi reservation, but what is the linkage between sort of the Hopi culture and Tewa, or how do you describe that to people?
Well, my Tewa background is from New Mexico, where my mother is from. My wife is Nicole, which is located in northern New Mexico, which is Oquia, Pueblo. But the Tewa-speaking tribes, there's several surrounding communities. There's Oquia, Pueblo, there's Santa Clara, Pueblo, Tisuki, or Tetsuge. But that entire region, and it's is in northern New Mexico, but there is a band of Tewas that migrated out to Hopi early on and settled out at Hopi as well.
So it really was a different tribe from Hopi, but you're on the Hopi reservation, but is there considerable overlap in terms of the cultures, you know,
there's
mythologies and philosophies?
There's a lot of similarities, parallels among our beliefs, traditions, and ceremonies. So it's interconnected. The language and the dialect is very different from Hopi to Tewa, but the ceremonies and things as such are very
okay,
very
so there is
similar.
quite a because they always show Hopi Tewa, you know, or the other way around when you do a lot of research, and so I wasn't, you know, I want to make sure we were kind of clear on that for folks, because it becomes important more for your father's work because of the history of his mother and grandmother and that side of the family and the whole pottery aspect.
Right.
And so, which obviously affects you, but your work is more what we're going to focus on today, which is really heavily influenced by your father, but also you didn't originally start out wanting to be an artist, correct?
Well, I wasn't quite too sure I was going to follow the footsteps because Michael, my brother, and I were sixth generation in our family of artisans.
Right.
So it goes back to Nomina, which was recognized for bringing back the traditions of Hopi pottery making. And so that's my great-great-great-grandmother. And on down, majority of our family lineage are all ceramists, and so all did pottery. And
right.
My father veered off and went off in his own direction as a painter, kind of covers the gamut and does sculpture and everything as well. But right, I wasn't quite too sure. My studies were more along the lines of architecture, being a draftsman, that kind of thing. But then growing up with our traditions and our ceremonies and things of that nature, and starting out as a Kachina doll carver and doing very literal work initially, just by partaking in the ceremonies in our culture, and doing those kinds of things. But artistically, for me, it became somewhat repetitive. And so I started breaking down the ideas and the imagery and things of that nature and just playing with positive and negative space. And I think just the idea also of the background of studying architecture and being influenced by architecture and being a draftsman, it kind of brought these two elements together. And so that's why these things became. But
you're right, the architecture I think probably did inform you in a really profound way now that you've mentioned that, because a lot of your pieces are, sort of tectonic and architectural, and we'll get into that. And some of them we're looking at have these framing devices, but also just the way you construct them. But the other thing too is the positive and negative space, because architects are always very sensitive to that. When a building or even in a room, an interior space, you have to think about the relationships of all these things and how people operate in a space. But the positives and negatives, I think, is what's fascinating about your work, and I think also gives it a really very contemporary aspect to it. And that's the one thing that I think always struck me with your work is it always seems so contemporary and fresh. It always seemed very sort of rooted in modernism, but very sensitive to a lot of formalist concerns in post-war abstraction and even especially looking in some of the more, not so much minimalism, because you don't really have a lot of that same sort of repetitiveness, and obviously your work is very hands-on. But I do like the negative space because there's also an illusory aspect to that, which
right.
is very interesting. So the viewer sort of fills in the dots. There's a little bit of a gestalt going on there where it kind of looks anthropomorphic, and you think it could be a face, and lo and behold, you really did intend it to be a face.
Right.
But what you've done is become very reductive. You've really taken complex images like a human form or face, and you've really tried to, it seems like, and especially there was a piece that's in a museum, I forget which museum, but it was one of the first times you sort of did a wall piece early on, and it was just the lines, and they're very elegant, and it's very, just like the gesture of like like a cheek or an
You're
eye.
right.
It's not the whole face, it's not the individual features. And I think it's like relief, and it was like it was in bronze or something, a triptych or something.
Yeah, it was a large diptych.
And but that was really very elegant, and I thought I think it sort of really profoundly affected your work going forward.
Yeah.
And so you've kind of maintained that nice just essence, and when you look at your work, you really do read a lot of things into it. But what's been interesting with the conversation with you, over the last couple of months, and then particularly like last night when we were talking, is there's so much more behind a lot of your work.
Yeah.
And that's what I'd like to kind of get into. Like to the right of Arlo is a piece that actually does reference the Kachinas,
right.
correct? And so you still favor that work, and you bring it in a lot of different ways. And so once you just kind of point to sort of what these different elements are.
Yeah, so, growing up again with the traditions, and the culture and partaking in the ceremonies and things of that nature, it's still a real strong foundation of my work. But again, it's playing with positive and negative space, and it's not literal of what you would actually see during a ceremony. So
Right.
you're almost getting just fragmentations of what you would witness during a particular ceremony. So they're just partial images. This is titled assemblage. And so this center portion here, and this kind of circle at the bottom refers to the idea of the mouth of that Kachina image. And what a Kachina is it serves the purpose as an intermediary between the physical and the spiritual world. These ceremonies, and so we have many various different Kachinas that make up what we say basically the universe. There's Kachinas that represent animal life, deer, antelope, and plant life, corn, squash, melons. Kachinas that are used for bringing up moisture, being very agricultural society, and it plays a very important role in our culture. So, but what you're seeing is just a partial image here, this being the eye, an indication of the eye, and this indication of markings that you would find on the face, another partial here. So it's very kind of abstracted, but just a composition of creating that face. But it's also kind of looking at it in a perspective of saying a non-native or a native of any culture really viewing a particular ceremony pertains to me if I see another culture as well. Maybe you may be moved by what's all taking place, but in all actuality, you're just kind of getting a very small glimpse of a very complex process. So it's kind of looking at it in that perspective as well.
Because your original dolls, I think you had said before, were much more detailed and more realistic looking or more literal. And you made that conscious decision then to kind of go with the essence. In some ways, looking at this oddly today from this angle, because I haven't looked at it this way, there's also a cubist element with some of these because of the fact that it's almost, you're getting different multiple views at the same time, but yet it's not purely cubist, obviously, but it's still those subtle references that when you look at it from a different angle, you know, it's anthropomorphic. You realize it's a face.
Right.
And so, but what we were talking about earlier today too, what I like about the fact that you've gone to, your work is so rooted in the cultures and histories, and that's what I want to touch on, because people are always fascinated, you know, by that, because your shapes, you know, do refer so specifically to these things, and you're so thoughtful about all these just subtle little elements within it. So it's almost like it's like codes or iconography. Yeah. That those who are in the know look at that and go, oh yeah, it's a timeline and it's this, that, and the other, and these are connections with different things. Other people just look at it as, wow, that's really a fascinating sort of formal piece, you know, and this interaction between materials and things like that. So I think this very contemporary approach, you're really able to think in sort of two worlds all the time. You know, how you bring in elements that bring in the content, while at the same time doing something that's contemporary, fresh, clean, not cluttered. It's kind of a challenge. You're dancing between two worlds, it seems like, all the time.
It's always kind of been that way, I think, even, well, with my work, but then also just personally, because I partake in the ceremonies and traditions, but then we have our business, we have our careers and our exhibitions, and so, you know, we're able to travel out and experience new things, but then it's also really nice to be able to come home and go straight back into our ceremonies and our traditions and things. So in that essence, we kind of almost live definitely in two worlds that way, which is kind of really nice, and that it's very rare that we are able to do those kinds of things. And so I think it just kind of transpires into the work itself too. So it's kind of relating to my experiences, and so I think it translates into the work itself. But yeah, so the timeline thing is kind of like looking at a landscape. I always wanted to create landscapes, but in a three-dimensional form, and so it's a way of doing that, you know, combining all the various different materials, but looking at a landscape almost in a geological perspective and the story and the timeline. And so that's why I have kind of that Texas shell in there. It's old seabed floor, so it's kind of telling the history of Mother Earth and that kind of thing. And then